There are empires that fade quietly into history, their names whispered like forgotten prayers. And then there are those that burn so brightly, so fiercely, that even their ashes glow in the dark for centuries. The Aztec Empire was fire itself, a civilization built on blood and beauty, on faith and fear, on temples that touched the clouds and hearts that beat their last beneath the sun. They called themselves the Mexica, children of prophecy, guided by visions and gods who demanded everything. In less than 200 years, they transformed from wandering outcasts into masters of a world that trembled at their name. They built floating gardens on water, cities that made conquistadors weep with wonder, and a cosmic order held together by ritual, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief that they were keeping the universe alive. But empires built on such intensity cannot last forever. The higher they rise, the farther they fall. And when the Aztecs fell, they fell like a star collapsing into itself, sudden, violent, and complete. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and sleep draws near, let us walk softly through their story. Let us see the glory and the terror, the devotion and the darkness, the rise that seemed unstoppable and the fall that came too fast. Close your eyes if you need to. Let the words carry you. This is the story of an empire that believed it could hold back the end of the world, until the world found them first. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too. A gentle tap, a quiet subscription, it costs you nothing but a moment, and it keeps these stories alive in the night. Let us walk through history together, one whispered tale at a time. Now, settle in. The story begins. There are stories that begin with kings and crowns, with marble halls and the clash of great armies. This story begins with mud. It begins with hunger. It begins with a people who had no home, no power, and no reason to believe they would ever matter. The Mexica were wanderers, driven from place to place like dust on the wind, scorned by the settled cities of the Valley of Mexico, tolerated only when they could be used and discarded when they could not. They had no temples, no monuments, no legacy carved in stone. All they had was a story. A prophecy. A promise whispered by their God in the language of visions and blood. And sometimes, when the world is dark enough, a story is all you need. The god's name was Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, the god of war and sun and will. He had led them out of a mythical homeland called Aztlan, a place lost to memory and time, and told them to walk until they found a sign. An eagle. A cactus. A serpent. 3 symbols woven together in an image that would mark the place where they would finally stop running. So they walked. For generations, they walked. Fathers told sons. Mothers told daughters. The prophecy became the thread that held them together when everything else threatened to pull them apart. They moved through deserts and mountains, through valleys ruled by kings who saw them as little more than beggars with weapons. They served as mercenaries when they had to, selling their strength to survive. They learned the ways of war from those who looked down on them, studying every tactic, every formation, every trick that might one day be turned back on their teachers. The Valley of Mexico was a place of water and light, ringed by mountains and dotted with lakes that shimmered like silver in the sun. City-states rose along the shores, Texcoco, Azcapotzalco, Culhuacan, each one jealous of the others, each one locked in the slow dance of alliance and betrayal that defined the region. The Mexica arrived as outsiders, unwanted, suspect. They were given the worst lands, the places no one else would take. Rocky hillsides. Swamps. Barren stretches where nothing would grow. They took what they were given and survived. They had no choice. Survival was the only option they had ever known. And then, in the year 1325, on a marshy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, a priest saw the sign. An eagle, magnificent and terrible, perched on a nopal cactus, its talons gripping a serpent that writhed and twisted in its beak. The image burned itself into the priest's mind, and when he told the others, they knew. This was the place. This muddy, unwanted island surrounded by reeds and water, this was where the prophecy would be fulfilled. This was where they would build their home. They called it Tenochtitlan, the place of the prickly pear cactus. It did not look like much. Not yet. But the Mexica had learned patience. They had learned to turn nothing into something, to make strength out of scarcity. They began to build. The lake was both their prison and their salvation. Other cities could attack them by land, but the water provided defense, a natural moat that made invasion difficult and costly. The Mexica became masters of the lake, learning to navigate its currents, to fish its depths, to turn its mud into fertile ground. They invented the chinampas, floating gardens built on rafts of reeds and soil, anchored to the lakebed with willow trees whose roots grew down and held everything in place. On these gardens, they grew maize and beans, tomatoes and chilies, flowers that would later fill their temples with color and scent. The chinampas were brilliant, efficient, almost miraculous in their productivity. From the water, the Mexica fed themselves. From the water, they began to grow strong. But strength alone was not enough. The Valley of Mexico was ruled by Azcapotzalco, a powerful city-state whose king, Tezozomoc, controlled much of the region through a combination of military might and ruthless diplomacy. The Mexica paid tribute to Azcapotzalco, as all the weaker cities did. They bent their necks and gave what was demanded. They played the role of servants, of vassals, of a people grateful just to exist. And all the while, they watched. They learned. They waited. Tezozomoc used them as soldiers, sending Mexica warriors to fight his wars, to crush his rivals, to do the bloody work that kept his empire intact. The Mexica did not refuse. They could not afford to. But every battle taught them something new. Every campaign made them sharper, harder, more dangerous. Years passed. Decades. Tenochtitlan grew from a collection of reed huts into something more substantial. Temples began to rise, modest at first, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, the rain god who blessed their crops. Canals were dug through the city, connecting neighborhoods, allowing canoes to glide through the streets like birds on water. Causeways were built, great roads stretching across the lake to connect the island to the mainland, engineered with removable bridges that could be lifted in times of danger. The city was becoming a fortress, a stronghold disguised as a village, a power waiting for its moment. And the moment was coming. Tezozomoc was old, and his empire was beginning to fracture. The cities he had dominated for so long were restless, watching, waiting for weakness. The Mexica were not the only ones planning for the future. But they were the most patient. They were the most willing to risk everything. In 1426, Tezozomoc died. He had ruled for decades, holding the Valley of Mexico in his iron grip, and his death left a vacuum that every ambitious city rushed to fill. His son, Maxtla, took the throne of Azcapotzalco, but he was not his father. He was cruel without wisdom, violent without strategy. He suspected treachery in every shadow and saw enemies in every ally. The cities that had bowed to Tezozomoc out of respect began to chafe under Maxtla's paranoia. And the Mexica, who had waited so long in the background, saw their opening. Their ruler at the time was Chimalpopoca, a young king caught between two worlds, loyal to Azcapotzalco by treaty, but desperate to free his people from servitude. Maxtla did not trust him. Perhaps he was right not to. Chimalpopoca's loyalties were murky, his alliances shifting, and in 1427, he died under suspicious circumstances. Some said Maxtla had him killed. Others whispered that his own people removed him to make way for someone stronger. The truth dissolved into rumor and blood, as truth so often does. What mattered was what came next. The Mexica chose a new leader, a man who had been waiting his entire life for this moment. His name was Itzcoatl, which means obsidian serpent, and he was everything Chimalpopoca had not been: decisive, fearless, willing to burn the world down if it meant his people would be free. Itzcoatl looked at Azcapotzalco and saw not a master, but an enemy. He looked at the tribute his people paid and saw chains. And he decided, with a clarity that must have felt like lightning in his chest, that the time for servitude was over. But he could not do it alone. The Mexica were strong, but they were not strong enough to defeat Azcapotzalco by themselves. Itzcoatl needed allies. He needed a coalition. And he found one in the most unlikely of places. Texcoco was a city of poets and scholars, ruled by a king named Nezahualcóyotl, whose name meant hungry coyote. He was a philosopher, an engineer, a man who wrote verses about the fleeting nature of life and the sorrow of beauty that cannot last. But he was also a survivor. Maxtla had murdered his father and driven him into exile, forcing him to watch from the shadows as his city fell under Azcapotzalco's control. Nezahualcóyotl wanted revenge. He wanted his throne back. And when Itzcoatl came to him with a proposal, an alliance to destroy Maxtla and reshape the balance of power in the valley, Nezahualcóyotl did not hesitate. They joined forces, and they brought in a third partner, the smaller city of Tlacopan, to legitimize their coalition and share the rewards. Together, they became the Triple Alliance. Together, they declared war. The war against Azcapotzalco was brutal and swift. Maxtla's cruelty had isolated him, and when the Triple Alliance marched, other cities either joined them or stood aside. The Mexica warriors, who had spent decades learning the art of war in service to others, now turned that knowledge against their former masters. They fought with an intensity born from generations of humiliation, every blow a strike for freedom, every victory a step towards something they had only dreamed of. Azcapotzalco fell in 1428. Maxtla was captured and executed, his city dismantled, its power shattered. The valley was no longer ruled by a single tyrant. It was now controlled by 3 cities, bound by treaty and mutual ambition. But everyone knew the truth. Tenochtitlan was the strongest of the 3. The Mexica were no longer servants. They were conquerors. Itzcoatl understood that power was not just about strength. It was about story. It was about belief. After the war, he did something extraordinary and terrible. He gathered all the old histories, the books and codices that recorded the past, and he burned them. He erased the memory of the Mexica as wanderers, as outcasts, as servants. And in its place, he created a new history. A history that said the Mexica had always been destined for greatness, that they were the chosen people of Huitzilopochtli, that their conquests were not acts of ambition but fulfillments of divine will. It was propaganda, yes, but it was also transformation. By controlling the past, Itzcoatl shaped the future. The Mexica became not just a people, but a myth. And myths are far more dangerous than men. Under Itzcoatl and his successors, Tenochtitlan began to expand. The Triple Alliance conquered city after city, pushing outward in every direction, bringing more and more of Mesoamerica under their control. But this was not empire in the way the Romans or the Mongols built empires. The Aztecs did not occupy the cities they defeated. They did not replace local rulers with their own governors. Instead, they demanded tribute. Gold, jade, cacao, feathers, textiles, food, and captives, endless streams of wealth flowing back to Tenochtitlan. The conquered cities kept their kings, their customs, their gods. All they had to do was pay. And if they refused, the Mexica army would return, and the cost of rebellion would be far higher than the cost of obedience. This system was efficient, but it was also fragile. The empire was held together not by loyalty, but by fear. The conquered peoples did not love the Aztecs. They resented them. They hated them. They waited for weakness, for a crack in the armor, for any chance to break free. But for now, there was no weakness. For now, Tenochtitlan grew richer and more magnificent with every passing year. The island city expanded, temples rising higher, palaces spreading wider, markets filling with goods from 100 cultures. Causeways stretched across the lake like stone veins, and aqueducts carried fresh water from the mainland to the city's fountains and pools. Tenochtitlan was becoming something the world had never seen before, a city on water, a jewel floating in silver, a place where the divine and the mortal walked side by side. And at the center of it all was the great temple, the Templo Mayor, a massive pyramid rising toward the sky, crowned with twin shrines to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. It was the axis of the universe, the place where heaven and earth met, the heart of the Aztec world. Every victory in war meant another layer added to the temple, another expansion, another offering of blood to the gods who made it all possible. The Mexica believed, with a faith that shaped every part of their lives, that they were keeping the world alive. That the sun would not rise without their sacrifices. That the universe itself depended on their devotion. This belief gave them purpose. It gave them meaning. And it would, in time, give them a hunger that could never be satisfied. Power, once tasted, is a difficult thing to put down. The Mexica had spent generations dreaming of freedom, and now that they had it, freedom was not enough. They wanted more. They wanted security. They wanted wealth. They wanted the kind of strength that would ensure no one could ever force them back into servitude again. And so, almost without meaning to, they became the very thing they had once feared, an empire that demanded submission, that took what it wanted, that spread across the land like a shadow growing longer as the sun climbed higher. The Triple Alliance was the engine of this transformation, but Tenochtitlan was its beating heart. The city grew fat on tribute, and its rulers grew ambitious with success. Each new conquest opened the door to another, and another, until the map of Mesoamerica was painted in Aztec colors. Itzcoatl ruled until 1440, and when he died, the throne passed to his nephew, a man named Moctezuma Ilhuicamina, Moctezuma the Elder, the first to bear that name. He was a warrior, brilliant and ruthless, and under his leadership the empire exploded outward like a fire catching dry wood. Moctezuma I expanded the empire in every direction, south toward the lands of the Mixtecs and Zapotecs, east toward the Gulf Coast, west into the territories of rival kingdoms. His armies moved like storms, swift and overwhelming, and the cities that resisted learned quickly that resistance was costly. Those that surrendered were allowed to keep their rulers and their ways of life, provided they paid tribute. Those that fought were crushed, their temples burned, their leaders sacrificed on Aztec altars. The message was clear. Submit, or be destroyed. But Moctezuma was not just a conqueror. He was a builder, a visionary who understood that an empire needed more than just military might to survive. He expanded Tenochtitlan's infrastructure, improving the aqueducts that brought fresh water to the city, widening the causeways that connected the island to the mainland, creating new neighborhoods and markets to accommodate the growing population. He commissioned the expansion of the Great Temple, adding new layers to the pyramid, making it taller, grander, more awe-inspiring. He wanted visitors to the city to feel small, to understand immediately that they were standing in the presence of something greater than themselves. And it worked. Ambassadors and traders who arrived in Tenochtitlan for the first time often stood speechless at the sight of it, a city rising from the water, its temples gleaming white in the sun, its canals alive with canoes, its markets bursting with goods from across the known world. The markets of Tenochtitlan became legendary. Tlatelolco, the great market district, drew tens of thousands of people every 5 days when the main market convened. Merchants sold everything imaginable, jade from the south, obsidian from the mountains, cacao beans that served as currency, brilliant feathers from tropical birds, jaguar pelts, pottery, textiles woven with intricate patterns, tools, weapons, medicine, food of every kind. There were sections for slaves, for animals, for luxury goods, for everyday necessities. The market was organized with a precision that impressed even the Spanish when they eventually arrived, each type of goods grouped together, prices regulated, disputes settled by appointed judges who walked the aisles ensuring fairness. It was capitalism and order woven together, a system that allowed wealth to flow through the city like water through its canals. But wealth brings envy, and envy brings danger. Not every city was willing to accept Aztec dominance, and some fought back with a ferocity that surprised even the battle-hardened Mexica warriors. The city of Tlaxcala, nestled in the mountains to the east, became the empire's most stubborn enemy. The Tlaxcalans were fierce, independent, and utterly unwilling to bow to Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs tried repeatedly to conquer them, launching campaign after campaign, but the Tlaxcalans held firm. They used the rough terrain to their advantage, ambushing Aztec forces in narrow passes, retreating into the mountains when pressed, emerging to strike again when the Aztecs thought the battle was won. The wars with Tlaxcala became a constant, a bleeding wound that would not heal, a reminder that even the greatest empire had limits. Yet the Aztecs adapted. If they could not conquer Tlaxcala outright, they would surround it, cutting off its trade routes, isolating it from potential allies. And in a strange way, the ongoing conflict served a purpose. It became the primary stage for the Flower Wars, the ritualized battles fought not for conquest but for captives. These wars were unlike anything else in the Aztec military tradition. They were scheduled, agreed upon by both sides, fought with rules and honor. Warriors from Tenochtitlan and Tlaxcala would meet on predetermined battlefields, and they would fight, not to kill, but to capture. The goal was to take prisoners alive, to bring them back for sacrifice. For the Aztecs, it was a way to honor the gods while keeping their warriors sharp. For the Tlaxcalans, it was a chance to prove their courage and strike back at their oppressors. Both sides hated each other, but both sides understood the ritual. It was war as ceremony, violence given meaning beyond mere death. The tribute system that funded the empire was staggering in its complexity and scope. Every conquered city was assessed based on its resources and required to send regular shipments to Tenochtitlan. Coastal cities sent dried fish, shells, and coral. Mountain regions sent timber and precious metals. Agricultural areas sent maize, beans, and chilies. Tropical zones sent cacao, vanilla, and exotic feathers. The tribute rolls, recorded in codices with meticulous detail, listed everything down to the exact number of blankets or jars of honey expected from each province. Failure to deliver meant punishment, sometimes a stern warning, sometimes a military intervention, sometimes the replacement of a local ruler with someone more compliant. The system was efficient, brutal, and deeply resented by those forced to participate in it. And yet, despite the resentment, the empire held. It held because the Aztecs were strong, yes, but also because they were smart. They played rival cities against each other, rewarding loyalty with privileges, punishing rebellion with swift and visible consequences. They allowed conquered peoples to keep their gods, integrating foreign deities into the Aztec pantheon, showing a religious tolerance that was rare for the time. They built alliances through marriage, sending noblewomen from Tenochtitlan to marry rulers of tributary cities, weaving a web of kinship that made rebellion more complicated. They used fear, yes, but they also used diplomacy, trade, and the promise that cooperation was far more profitable than resistance. For decades, it worked. For decades, the empire grew. By the time Moctezuma I died in 1469, the empire had become something almost unrecognizable from the muddy island settlement where the prophecy had been fulfilled. Tenochtitlan was now a metropolis, home to perhaps 200,000 people, one of the largest cities in the world at that time. Its population rivaled that of Paris or Constantinople, and in some ways it surpassed them. The engineering alone was staggering, a city built on water, sustained by ingenuity and will, connected to the world by roads and canals that pulsed with constant traffic. Merchants traveled from the farthest reaches of the empire to trade in its markets. Pilgrims came to worship at its temples. Ambassadors arrived bearing gifts and fear in equal measure. Tenochtitlan had become the center of everything, the place where power lived and breathed. Moctezuma's successor was his grandson, Ashiyakutle, a young warrior whose reign would test the empire's limits in ways no one had anticipated. Ashiyakutle was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious, and he pushed the boundaries of expansion farther than ever before. He led campaigns to the west, into the lands controlled by the Puripeka Empire, also known as the Tarascans. The Puripeka were formidable, they had developed advanced metallurgy, creating bronze and copper weapons that were superior to the obsidian blades and wooden clubs the Aztecs relied on. When Ashiyakutle's army met the Puripeka in battle, they were defeated decisively. It was a humiliating loss, one that shattered the illusion of Aztec invincibility and reminded everyone, including the Aztecs themselves, that they were not unstoppable. The empire had found its western limit. Beyond that border lay a power they could not break. But Ashiyakutl's reign was not defined solely by defeat. He also achieved something remarkable and terrible. He conquered Tlatelolco, Tenochtitlan's sister city on the same island. Tlatelolco had always been separate, proud of its independence, its control over the great market, its identity as something distinct from the imperial capital. But tensions between the two cities had been growing for years, and in 1473, they boiled over into open war. The fighting was brutal, brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, blood spilling on streets they had once shared in peace. Ashiyakutl's forces won, and Tlatelolco was absorbed into Tenochtitlan, losing its independence forever. The great market remained, but it was now firmly under Aztec control. The victory unified the island, but it also revealed something darker. The Aztecs would not tolerate rivals, even among their own people. Unity would be enforced, whether willingly given or violently taken. After Ashiyakutle came Tizoc, whose reign was brief and unremarkable. He lacked the fire of his predecessors, and his military campaigns were lackluster at best. The empire stagnated under his rule, and there were whispers, always whispers in places of power, that he was not fit to lead. He died in 1486 under circumstances that were never fully explained, and the throne passed to his brother, Ahuitzotl, a man who would take the empire to heights that seemed almost impossible. Ahuitzotl was a warrior's warrior, fierce and relentless, and he understood that an empire that stops expanding begins to die. He launched campaigns in every direction, conquering territories that had resisted Aztec control for decades, pushing the empire's borders to their greatest extent. Under his rule, the Aztec domain stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing hundreds of city-states and millions of people. Ahuitzotl's most famous act was the reconsecration of the Great Temple in 1487. The temple had been expanded yet again, and to mark the occasion, Ahuitzotl ordered a ceremony unlike anything the world had seen before. Captives from recent wars were brought to Tenochtitlan by the thousands, lined up in rows that stretched for miles. For 4 days and 4 nights, the sacrifices continued. Priests worked in shifts, their arms growing tired from the endless repetition, the blade rising, the blade falling, the body tumbling down the temple steps. The exact number of victims is debated, lost to time and exaggeration, but the lowest estimates speak of thousands, the highest of tens of thousands. Rivers of blood flowed down the temple, pooling in the plaza below, staining the stones red. The smell of death hung over the city like a fog. It was meant to be a demonstration of power, of devotion, of the empire's unshakable belief in its divine purpose. And it was. But it was also a demonstration of something else, the terrifying scale of Aztec religion, the way beauty and horror were so thoroughly intertwined that they became impossible to separate. To understand the Aztecs, you must understand this duality. They were not simply bloodthirsty savages, as their enemies and later the Spanish would portray them. They were poets and mathematicians, astronomers and engineers. They created art of stunning beauty, feather mosaics so intricate they seemed to shimmer with life, sculptures carved from jade and obsidian that captured the human form with heartbreaking precision, codices painted with colors that have not faded in 500 years. They wrote poetry that spoke of the fleeting nature of existence, of flowers that bloom and die, of the sorrow of knowing that all things must end. Nezahualcóyotl, the philosopher king of Texcoco and ally of the Aztecs, wrote verses that still echo with melancholy beauty. All the earth is a grave, he wrote, and nothing escapes it. Yet these same people who created such beauty also believed that the universe was fragile, that it had been created and destroyed 4 times before, and that they lived in the 5th sun, the final age, an age that would end in earthquakes and darkness unless the gods were fed. Blood was the food of the gods, and human blood was the most precious offering of all. The Aztecs did not invent human sacrifice, it was practiced by many Mesoamerican cultures long before they arrived. But they refined it, systematized it, made it the central pillar of their religion and their state. Every major event required sacrifice. The dedication of a temple. The coronation of a king. The planting and harvest seasons. Victories in war. eclipses and droughts and anything else that suggested the gods were displeased. The priests cut open chests and tore out beating hearts. They flayed the skin from captives and wore it in rituals dedicated to Totec, the flayed god. They drowned children to bring rain. They burned victims alive as offerings to the fire god. It was systematic, ritualized, and terrifyingly routine. And yet, to the Aztecs, it made perfect sense. They were not cruel. They were devout. They believed, with an intensity that shaped every aspect of their civilization, that they were keeping the universe alive, that without their sacrifices the sun would not rise, the crops would not grow, and the world would end. This was not evil. This was duty. This was love, in the most profound and terrible sense of the word. They loved the world so much that they were willing to feed it blood to keep it turning. And so the sacrifices continued, year after year, thousands upon thousands of lives given to the gods, and the empire grew stronger, richer, more magnificent. Until, one day, the gods stopped listening. Or perhaps they never had been listening at all. There are wars fought for land, and wars fought for gold, and wars fought because old hatreds burn too hot to ever cool. And then there are wars fought for something else entirely, wars where the goal is not conquest but communion, not victory but devotion, not death but transcendence. The flower wars were all of these things and none of them, a strange and terrible ritual that blurred the line between battle and ceremony, between violence and worship. They were called Xochitl Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, flowery wars, wars of flowers, and the name itself reveals something essential about how the Aztecs saw the world. Death was not an ending. It was a blossoming. Blood was not a tragedy. It was a gift. And war was not mere destruction. It was a sacred dance performed on a stage built from bone and belief. The flower wars emerged from necessity and transformed into theology. After the Great Famine of the 1450s, when drought gripped the Valley of Mexico and people starved in the streets, the Aztec priests declared that the gods were hungry. The cosmos was out of balance. The sun was weakening. Something had to be done, and that something was sacrifice on a scale never before attempted. But constant wars of conquest would drain the empire's resources and turn potential tributaries into lifelong enemies. A different kind of war was needed, one that could provide a steady supply of captives without destroying valuable cities or disrupting trade. And so the flower wars were born, arranged conflicts fought by mutual agreement between the Aztecs and their rivals, primarily the Tlaxcalans, the Huexincancans, and the people of Cholula. These were not secret arrangements whispered in darkness. They were formal agreements, negotiated and scheduled, with rules both sides understood and honored. Armies would gather on predetermined fields at agreed-upon times. The warriors came dressed in their finest, feathered headdresses, jaguar pelts, elaborate shields painted with the symbols of their gods and lineages. They carried obsidian-studded clubs called macuahuitl, weapons sharp enough to decapitate a horse, though horses had not yet arrived in their world. They carried atlotls, spear-throwers that could launch projectiles with deadly force. They wore quilted cotton armor that could stop arrows and soften blows. They painted their faces and bodies, transforming themselves into living representations of the gods they served. And then they fought. But this was not fighting as other cultures understood it. The goal was not to kill. Killing an enemy in a flower war was almost wasteful, a loss of potential. The goal was to capture, to take your opponent alive, to prove your skill and courage by subduing a warrior without ending his life. It required incredible technique, strength, and bravery. You had to close with your enemy, grapple with him, overpower him while he fought with everything he had, and drag him from the battlefield. It was intimate, exhausting, and deeply personal. Warriors who captured multiple enemies gained honor, status, elevation through the ranks of Aztec society. Those who captured 4 enemies became nobles, members of the elite warrior orders, the Jaguar Knights and the Eagle Knights, whose prowess in battle made them legends. For the captured, there was no shame, only acceptance. They knew what awaited them. They had always known. From childhood, Aztec boys were told that the most honorable death was not in old age, surrounded by family, but on the sacrificial stone or in battle. To die feeding the gods was to achieve transcendence, to be reborn as hummingbirds or butterflies, to accompany the sun on its daily journey across the sky. The warriors of Tlaxcala believed the same. Their cosmology was not so different from the Aztecs. They hated their enemies, yes, but they shared their faith. And so the captured warriors walked to their deaths with heads held high, singing, sometimes even requesting the honor of being sacrificed at the great temple. They were not victims in their own eyes. They were offerings. They were necessary. The procession to the temple was its own kind of ceremony. The captives were dressed in fine clothes, their faces painted, their hair adorned with feathers. They were treated with respect, even reverence, in the days leading up to their deaths. They were given good food, sometimes pulque, the sacred alcoholic drink made from agave, to dull the fear and pain. Some were chosen to impersonate gods, living for weeks or months as divine representatives, worshipped and honored before their inevitable end. And when the day came, they climbed the steps of the great temple, 114 steps rising toward the sky, toward the twin shrines at the summit where Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc waited. The priests stood at the top, dressed in black robes stained with old blood, their hair matted and long, their bodies painted, their ears shredded from ritual bloodletting. They were terrifying and holy, intermediaries between the human and divine. The sacrifice itself was swift. The captive was laid across the sacrificial stone, a curved block designed to arch the chest upward. 4 priests held the limbs. A 5th, the high priest, raised the obsidian blade, black glass sharper than any metal, shaped for this single purpose. The blade descended, cutting through skin and muscle and bone, opening the chest. The priest reached inside and tore out the heart while it still beat, holding it aloft toward the sun, offering it to the gods as the body convulsed and then went still. The heart was placed in a vessel called a kuoxicali, an eagle bowl, and the body was pushed down the temple steps, tumbling, rolling, leaving a trail of blood that would be washed away only to be replaced by the next, and the next, and the next. On ordinary days, there might be a handful of sacrifices. On festival days, dozens. On great occasions like the temple dedication under a Huitzotl, thousands. The bodies were not simply discarded. In Aztec belief, everything had purpose, everything had meaning. The flesh of sacrificial victims was sometimes consumed in ritual cannibalism, not out of hunger but as an act of communion, a way of taking the warrior's strength and courage into oneself. The skull was cleaned and placed on the tsimpantli, the skull rack, enormous structures that displayed thousands of human skulls in neat rows, a monument to devotion and a warning to enemies. Spanish conquistadors who later saw these racks were horrified, counting skulls by the thousands, writing letters home describing walls of death that stretched farther than they could see. To the Aztecs, it was not horror. It was glory. Each skull represented a life given to sustain the world, a warrior who had fulfilled his purpose, a soul that had transcended mortality. The flower wars were not just about sacrifice. They were also about proving worth, about maintaining the edge of a warrior culture that defined itself through martial excellence. In Aztec society, warfare was not simply a profession, it was the path to meaning, to honor, to a place in the cosmos that extended beyond death. Boys were trained from childhood to be warriors. They learned to use the macuahuitl and the atlotl, to move in formation, to endure pain without flinching. They were taught that cowardice was the greatest shame, that to flee from battle was to disgrace not only yourself but your family, your kalpuli, your neighborhood clan, and your gods. The first time a young warrior captured an enemy, there was celebration. Feasts were held. Songs were sung. His hair, which had been worn long as a mark of his youth and inexperience, was cut in a particular style that announced to everyone that he had proven himself. He was no longer a boy. He was a warrior. But the flower wars were not universally celebrated, even within the empire. There were those who questioned whether this endless cycle of ritualized violence was truly necessary, whether the gods really demanded so much blood, or whether the priests had created a system that served their own power as much as it served the divine. Nezahualcóyotl, the philosopher king of Texcoco, was rumored to have harbored doubts. He built a temple to the unknown god, a deity without form or name, and some scholars believe he was moving toward a more abstract, less blood-soaked form of worship. But Nezahualcóyotl was an exception, a thinker in a world that valued action, a poet in an empire built on war. His doubts, if he truly held them, died with him. The flower wars continued. And they were beautiful, in their way. That is the hardest thing to accept, the most uncomfortable truth. The Aztecs did not see sacrifice as ugly. They saw it as the highest form of art, a performance that brought together music, dance, costume, architecture, and human devotion in a spectacle that was meant to move the gods themselves. The great festivals of the Aztec calendar were carefully choreographed events that lasted days, sometimes weeks. There was the festival of Toxcatl, when a young man chosen to represent Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror god, lived for an entire year as a divine being. He was given 4 wives, fine clothes, the best food. People bowed to him in the streets. He played a flute as he walked, and his music was considered sacred. And then, when the year ended, he climbed the temple steps alone, breaking his flute on each step as he ascended, and at the top, he was sacrificed. His heart was given to the sun. His body tumbled down. And the next year, a new god impersonator was chosen, and the cycle began again. There was Tlacaxipulistli, the festival of the flayed god, Xipe-Totec, when captives were sacrificed and their skin removed in a single piece. Priests wore these skins for 20 days, dancing through the streets, the dead flesh rotting slowly on their bodies, the smell overwhelming, the sight both horrifying and sacred. It was meant to represent renewal, the earth shedding its dead skin to reveal new growth beneath, the cycle of death and rebirth that governed all existence. To watch it must have been unbearable. To participate in it must have required a depth of faith that is almost impossible to imagine from our distance, from our world where such things belong only to nightmares and history books that make us shudder. There was Huitozotli, a spring festival dedicated to the rain god Tlaloc, when children were sacrificed to bring the rains. The priests chose children with particular features, double cowlicks, certain birthmarks, signs that they were favored by Tlaloc. The children were dressed beautifully, carried in litters through the city, and then taken to mountaintop shrines where they were killed. If they cried on the way, it was seen as a good omen, their tears were sympathetic magic, calling forth the rain. Parents who gave their children for this purpose were honored. The children themselves were told they were going to a paradise, Tlalocan, the garden of the rain god, where it was always spring and there was no hunger, no pain, no sorrow. Whether they believed it, whether it brought them comfort, we will never know. Their small bones have been found in mountain caves, offerings to a god who might or might not have been listening. The scale of sacrifice varied wildly depending on the source. Spanish chroniclers, eager to justify the conquest and paint the Aztecs as monsters, reported numbers that seem almost impossible: 20,000 sacrificed in a single day, 50,000 in a year, bloodshed on an industrial scale. Modern scholars are more cautious, suggesting the numbers were exaggerated, that the Spanish wanted to emphasize the horror to make their own brutality seem like salvation. But even the most conservative estimates are staggering. Thousands died each year on Aztec altars. The empire ran on blood the way others ran on gold or iron or grain. It was the currency of their cosmology, the fuel that kept the fifth sun burning in the sky. And yet, life in Tenochtitlan was not defined solely by death. The city was vibrant, alive, filled with color and sound and constant motion. The markets bustled from dawn to dusk. Children played in the streets and canals, learning to paddle canoes almost before they could walk. Musicians played drums and flutes at festivals. Artisans created jewelry of gold and jade so fine that Spanish conquistadors would later weep at its beauty even as they melted it down into ingots. There were schools, the Telpacali for commoners, where boys learned warfare and practical skills, and the Calmecac for nobles, where they studied history, astronomy, poetry, and the complex calendar system that governed Aztec life. Women ran households, wove textiles of extraordinary intricacy, managed family businesses, and held significant authority within their communities. Some became priestesses, healers, midwives, roles of deep respect and power. The Aztecs understood pleasure as well as pain. They drank pulque and chocolate, the latter reserved primarily for nobles and warriors, a bitter brew mixed with chili peppers that was believed to grant strength and courage. They enjoyed elaborate feasts, with dishes made from turkey, dog, fish, countless varieties of maize preparations, tamales, and tortillas. They grew flowers not just for religious purposes but for beauty, creating gardens that were famous throughout Mesoamerica. They bathed frequently, sometimes twice a day, using steam baths called temazcali that served both hygienic and spiritual purposes. The Spanish, who bathed rarely by comparison, were struck by how clean the Aztecs were, how their city smelled of flowers and incense rather than the filth that characterized European cities of the same era. But the shadow of the temple fell across everything. No matter how beautiful the city, no matter how sophisticated the culture, the drumbeat of sacrifice never stopped. It was the rhythm that underlay all Aztec life, the heartbeat of their civilization. And it created enemies. Every captive taken from Tlaxcala, from Huexinco, from Cholula, was a reason for hatred, a wound that would not heal, a memory that would wait for its chance at revenge. The Aztecs built an empire on the belief that they were serving the gods, keeping the universe in balance, fulfilling a cosmic duty that no one else could bear. But to those who lost sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, fathers and mothers to Aztec altars, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like cruelty disguised as piety, like murder wrapped in prayer. And when strangers arrived from across the sea, carrying weapons the Aztecs had never seen and riding animals they had never imagined, those old enemies would remember everything. They would remember the blood, the tears, the bodies tumbling down temple steps. And they would show the strangers the way to Tenochtitlan's heart. There are moments in history when the world tilts, when everything that seems solid begins to crack, when the future arrives wearing a face no one recognizes. For the Aztecs, that moment began not with the arrival of strangers, but with signs, omens that appeared in the years before the Spanish came, warnings written in fire and shadow, whispers from gods who had grown distant or perhaps had never been there at all. The Mexica had always been people of prophecy, born from a vision of an eagle and a serpent, guided by divine messages toward a destiny they believed was carved into the fabric of the cosmos. But the omens that came in the early 1500s spoke of endings, not beginnings. They spoke of darkness approaching, of a world about to change in ways that could not be undone. The first omen appeared around 1510, 10 years before the Spanish landed on the coast. A column of fire appeared in the eastern sky, a comet or meteor that blazed night after night, visible even in daylight according to some accounts. It rose like a pyramid of flame, scattering sparks, illuminating the darkness with a light that felt wrong somehow, too bright, too persistent. The people of Tenochtitlan watched it with growing dread. The priests consulted their codices, searching for meaning, and what they found was not comforting. Fire in the east. A wound in the sky. The direction of birth becoming the direction of death. Moctezuma II, who had taken the throne in 1502, demanded explanations. His astronomers and soothsayers gave him what answers they could, but their voices trembled. Something was coming. They could feel it the way animals feel earthquakes before the ground begins to shake. The second omen was even more disturbing. The temple of Huitzilopochtli, the most sacred structure in the empire, burst into flames without cause. No lightning had struck it. No torch had been carelessly dropped. The fire simply appeared, erupting from within the wooden roof and spreading with unnatural speed. People rushed to extinguish it, carrying water from the canals, but the flames would not die. They burned hotter the more water was thrown upon them, as if the fire were alive, as if it were hungry. By the time it finally exhausted itself, the temple roof was destroyed. The priests stood in the ashes, silent and afraid. A temple burning from within, it was as if the gods themselves were abandoning their home, as if the divine protection that had kept Tenochtitlan safe for 2 centuries was beginning to crumble. Then came the third omen. The temple of Xiaotlicutli, the fire god, was struck by lightning. Not during a storm, the sky was clear, the air still. The lightning came from nowhere, a bolt that tore through the heavens and shattered the temple's roof. Stone cracked. Wood splintered. And then it began to rain, a soft drizzle that felt more like tears than weather. The people whispered that the gods were weeping. The priests performed rituals, offered sacrifices, pleaded with the divine powers to explain what was happening, to tell them what could be done to restore balance. But the gods were silent. Or perhaps they were speaking, and what they were saying was simply too terrible to hear. The fourth omen came from the lake itself. Lake Texcoco, which had cradled Tenochtitlan since its founding, began to boil. The water churned and frothed without wind, without cause, rising up in waves that crashed against the causeways and flooded parts of the city. Buildings collapsed. People drowned in their homes. The water seemed angry, violent, as if the lake that had given the Aztecs life was now trying to reclaim it. When the strange tide finally receded, the survivors stood on the muddy streets and wondered what they had done to deserve this, what cosmic law they had broken, what price the gods were demanding now. The fifth omen was a voice in the darkness. People began to report hearing a woman crying in the night, wailing through the streets of Tenochtitlan with a grief that seemed to contain all the sorrow of the world. They called her Cihuacotl, the snake woman, an ancient goddess associated with childbirth and death. Her voice echoed through the canals and across the plazas. "My children," she cried, "we are lost. My children, where shall I take you?" Those who heard her could not sleep. The sound worked its way into their dreams, turned rest into nightmare, made them wake with the conviction that something precious was slipping away, that time was running out, that an ending approached that would spare no one. The sixth omen was perhaps the strangest of all. Fishermen on the lake caught a bird, a crane with ashen feathers, and brought it to Moctezuma because it had something unusual embedded in its head, a mirror, or something like a mirror, a circular surface that reflected not the world around it but something else entirely. Moctezuma looked into the mirror and saw the night sky in the middle of the day, stars blazing in impossible daylight. And then the stars began to move, taking shapes he did not recognize, figures mounted on animals that looked like deer but were not deer, moving in formation, armed and armored. He called for his priests and soothsayers, demanding they interpret what he was seeing. But when they arrived, the bird vanished. It simply disappeared from the hands of those holding it, leaving nothing behind but the memory of its impossible mirror and the vision it had contained. The seventh and eighth omens came together, supernatural creatures appeared in the streets, beings with 2 heads or malformed bodies, monsters that walked through the city and then vanished before they could be captured or questioned. People reported seeing them in markets, in temples, near the canals. They appeared and disappeared like smoke, like dreams that had leaked into waking reality. And alongside these apparitions came stories of strange lights moving across the lake at night, of sounds that came from no earthly source, of a sense that the boundary between the world of the living and the world of spirits was growing thin, permeable, dangerous. Moctezuma II was not a weak man, but he was a haunted one. He had inherited an empire at its zenith, a realm that stretched from ocean to ocean, that commanded tribute from millions, that seemed eternal in its power. But he had also inherited the weight of Aztec theology, the belief that the fifth sun would one day end, that the gods were capricious and demanding, that cosmic balance was fragile and required constant vigilance. The omens terrified him not because he was superstitious in the way we might understand superstition, but because he was devout. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that the universe spoke through signs, that the gods communicated through the language of fire and blood and strange visions. And everything he was seeing told him the same thing: change was coming, vast and terrible, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He consulted everyone. The priests performed endless rituals, sacrificing captives by the hundreds, trying to appease whatever divine anger had been kindled. The astronomers studied the stars, searching for patterns, for guidance, for some indication of what was approaching and when it would arrive. The wise men of the Calmecac debated late into the night, poring over old codices, examining prophecies and histories, looking for precedents. Some spoke of the legend of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the god who had once ruled the Toltecs in a golden age before being driven away by darker powers. The legend said that Quetzalcoatl had sailed east across the ocean, promising to return in the year Suacatl, one reed, which in the Aztec calendar corresponded to 1519. The year was approaching. Some wondered if the omens heralded not destruction but the return of a god. Others were less optimistic. In the spring of 1519, the waiting ended. Word reached Tenochtitlan from the eastern coast. Strange towers had been seen floating on the ocean, structures that moved across the water as if by magic. They were not boats as the Aztecs understood boats. They were massive, made of wood and canvas, with white wings that caught the wind. And from these floating towers came men unlike any the Mexica had ever encountered. Their skin was pale, some with hair the color of sun-bleached maize or fire itself. They wore metal that covered their bodies, armor that glinted in the light and seemed impervious to obsidian blades. They carried weapons that spoke with thunder and lightning, sticks that roared and killed from distances that made archery seem like child's play. And most terrifying of all, some of these men rode atop enormous beasts, four-legged creatures that moved like deer but were as large as houses, with manes and terrible teeth. The Aztecs had no word for these animals. They had never seen horses before. To them, horse and rider appeared as one being, a centaur from a nightmare. The leader of these strangers was a man named Hernán Cortés, 34 years old, ambitious to the point of recklessness, intelligent, charismatic, and utterly ruthless when circumstances demanded it. He had come from Cuba with a fleet of 11 ships, carrying about 500 Spanish soldiers, 100 sailors, 16 horses, and a handful of cannons. His official mission was to explore and trade, but Cortés had other plans. He wanted gold. He wanted glory. He wanted to carve his name into history in letters so large they could never be erased. And when he heard rumors of a great empire inland, an empire ruled from a golden city on a lake, a place of unimaginable wealth, something ignited in him, a hunger that would reshape the world. Moctezuma's coastal vassals sent messengers racing to Tenochtitlan with reports. They brought drawings of the ships, descriptions of the strangers, and samples of what they had been given in initial exchanges, glass beads, metal tools, cloth woven in patterns the Aztecs had never seen. Moctezuma studied these items with a mixture of fascination and dread. Were these men gods? Were they the prophesied return of Quetzalcoatl? Or were they something else, something even the prophecies had not anticipated? He decided to send gifts, a diplomatic gesture that would prove catastrophic. He sent his most skilled artisans work, masks made of turquoise, necklaces of gold and jade, elaborate feathered headdresses worth more than most kingdoms. He sent food, textiles, and a message: stay where you are. Do not come to Tenochtitlan. You are welcome to these gifts, but you are not welcome here. Cortés looked at the gold and saw only one thing, proof that the rumors were true, that somewhere inland there was wealth beyond imagining, and all he had to do was take it. The gifts did not dissuade him. They inflamed him. He made a decision that would define everything that followed. He burned his ships. Literally burned them, destroying his fleet so that his men would have no choice but to march forward, no possibility of retreat. It was an act of absolute commitment, the gamble of a man who understood that great rewards require great risks. His soldiers, watching their only escape route disappear in smoke and flames, must have felt terror and exhilaration in equal measure. There was no going back now. They would march inland, find this golden city, and either conquer it or die trying. But Cortés was not simply a brutal conqueror. He was also a diplomat, shrewd enough to understand that 500 men, no matter how well armed, could not defeat an empire of millions through force alone. He needed allies. And he found them. The first were the Totonacs, a coastal people who had been paying tribute to the Aztecs for decades and resented every moment of it. When Cortés arrived, they saw opportunity. Here were strangers with weapons of incredible power, men who seemed unafraid of the mighty Mexica. If these strangers could be convinced to fight the Aztecs, perhaps liberation was possible. The Totonacs welcomed Cortés, fed his men, told him stories of Aztec oppression, of the endless tribute, of the fear that permeated every corner of the empire. And Cortés listened, filing away every detail, every grievance, every crack in the empire's foundation. As Cortés marched inland, more allies joined him. The city of Sempoala pledged its support. Smaller towns and villages, tired of Aztec dominance, saw the Spanish as potential liberators, or at least as weapons that could be aimed at a hated enemy. Cortés played his role perfectly, presenting himself as a friend to the oppressed, promising freedom and partnership to those who joined him. The army that moved toward Tenochtitlan was growing, but most of it was not Spanish. Most of it was indigenous, warriors from a dozen different cultures united by a common hatred of the Aztecs. Cortés had perhaps 600 Spanish soldiers by the time he reached the highlands. But he commanded thousands of indigenous allies. He was not invading. He was leading a rebellion. And then he came to Tlaxcala, the mountain republic that had resisted Aztec domination for decades, the empire's most stubborn enemy. The Tlaxcalans did not immediately welcome the Spanish. They attacked, testing these strangers in battle, and what they found astonished them. The Spanish horses were devastating, breaking through infantry lines like nothing the Tlaxcalans had faced before. The Spanish swords and pikes, made of steel, cut through Tlaxcalan obsidian weapons as if they were made of paper. And the guns, the harquebuses and cannons, brought death from distances that made traditional warfare almost meaningless. The Tlaxcalans fought bravely, but after several engagements, they reconsidered. If they could not defeat these strangers, perhaps they could make use of them. A council was held. Debates raged. And finally, a decision was reached. The Tlaxcalans would ally with Cortés. They would guide him to Tenochtitlan. And they would help him destroy the empire that had been their enemy for generations. Moctezuma received reports of all of this, the Spanish advance, the growing coalition, the alliance with Tlaxcala. Each piece of news must have felt like a stone added to a weight pressing down on his chest. He sent more emissaries to Cortés, more gifts, more pleas to turn back. He tried intimidation, sending messages that warned of the empire's power, the size of its armies, the futility of resistance. He tried bribery, offering gold and tribute if only the Spanish would leave. Nothing worked. Cortés kept marching. And as he drew closer to the capital, Moctezuma faced an impossible decision. Should he order his armies to attack, to meet the Spanish on the road and destroy them before they reached Tenochtitlan? Or should he wait, welcome them, try to manage the situation through diplomacy and cunning? History records that he chose to wait. But perhaps it was not truly a choice. Perhaps he was paralyzed by doubt, by the terrible possibility that these strangers were divine, that to fight them would be to fight the gods themselves. Or perhaps he simply could not believe that his empire, so vast and powerful, could truly be threatened by a few hundred foreigners and their indigenous allies. Either way, he waited. And while he waited, Cortés came closer. On November 8, 1519, Hernán Cortés and his army reached the causeways that led across the lake to Tenochtitlan. What they saw stopped them in their tracks. The city rose from the water like something from a dream, its white temples and pyramids gleaming in the morning sun, its canals alive with thousands of canoes moving like schools of fish, its markets and plazas stretching farther than the eye could see. The causeways themselves were marvels, stone roads wide enough for 8 horsemen to ride abreast, stretching for miles across the lake, with removable wooden bridges that could be raised to make the city impregnable. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, one of the conquistadors who marched with Cortés, would later write that it reminded him of the enchanted places described in the romance of Amadis, that some of his comrades wondered if they were dreaming. This was not a barbaric city. This was not a primitive settlement. This was a metropolis that rivaled anything in Europe, and the Spanish knew it instantly. Moctezuma came out to meet them. He was carried in a golden litter borne by nobles, shaded by a canopy of green feathers worked with gold and silver and pearls. He wore sandals with soles of gold. His cloak was adorned with jade and turquoise. He was 47 years old, slender, clean-shaven in the Aztec manner, dignified in bearing despite whatever turmoil churned inside him. When he descended from the litter, servants spread cloths on the ground so that his feet would not touch the earth directly. He approached Cortés with a formality that bordered on reverence, welcoming him to Tenochtitlan, offering gifts and quarters in a palace that had belonged to Moctezuma's father. Cortés, for his part, tried to embrace the emperor in the Spanish fashion, but Moctezuma's attendants physically stopped him. No one touched the emperor. It was not done. The two men stood facing each other, the ruler of an empire and the man who would destroy it, and spoke through interpreters, each trying to understand the other, each concealing their true intentions beneath layers of diplomatic courtesy. The Spanish were given rooms in the Palace of Axayacatl, a sprawling complex with gardens and courtyards, comfortable quarters by any standard. But comfort could not mask the reality of their situation. They were 600 men in a city of 200,000, surrounded by an empire of millions. They were guests, yes, but they were also prisoners. The causeways could be cut at any moment. The wooden bridges could be raised. The city could become a trap from which there would be no escape. Cortés understood this immediately. And so, less than a week after arriving, he made a move so audacious it bordered on insanity. He took Moctezuma hostage. Using a pretext, Aztec forces had killed some Spanish soldiers on the coast. Cortés demanded that Moctezuma come to the Spanish quarters and remain there as a guarantee of good behavior. The emperor, incredibly, agreed. Whether he was paralyzed by indecision, whether he believed submission was the best way to protect his people, or whether he truly thought these were gods who could not be opposed, we will never fully know. But he came. He moved into the Spanish quarters, governed from captivity, maintained the fiction that he was still in control even as his authority crumbled. For months, this impossible situation held. Moctezuma ruled his empire from Spanish quarters, issuing orders that were obeyed because the alternative, chaos, civil war, the collapse of the cosmic order, was too frightening to contemplate. Cortés extracted gold from the emperor, melted down treasures that had taken generations to create, sent the ingots back to the coast to be shipped to Spain as proof of his success. He explored the city, mapping its defenses, noting the location of temples and arsenals. His men grew restless. They were living in luxury but trapped, aware that at any moment the city could turn on them. The Aztec people watched this strange captivity with confusion and growing anger. Their emperor was a prisoner in his own capital, and he did nothing. The gods must be angry. Something must be done. Then, in the spring of 1520, everything unraveled. Cortés received word that another Spanish expedition had landed on the coast, sent by the governor of Cuba to arrest him for insubordination. Cortés had burned his ships and defied orders, and now consequences were arriving. He made a desperate decision: he would leave Tenochtitlan, march to the coast, and confront this new threat before it could destroy him. He left behind a garrison of about 80 men under the command of Pedro de Alvarado, a man whose nickname was the Sun because of his blonde hair, but whose temperament was far darker. Cortés marched away, leaving Alvarado in charge of a city on the edge of explosion. It was a mistake that would cost thousands of lives. The festival of Tenochtitlan was approaching, one of the most important ceremonies in the Aztec calendar. The people of Tenochtitlan asked Alvarado for permission to hold the festival, promising there would be no violence, only dancing and prayer. Alvarado agreed, but he was suspicious. He believed, or claimed to believe, that the festival was a cover for rebellion, that the Aztecs planned to use it as an opportunity to attack. And so he decided to strike first. On May 22, 1520, as hundreds of Aztec nobles danced unarmed in the courtyard of the Great Temple, Alvarado gave the order. Spanish soldiers sealed the exits and attacked. They cut down dancers with swords. They shot them with harquebuses. They slaughtered priests and nobles, men and women, young and old, killing without mercy or hesitation. The courtyard became a slaughterhouse, blood pooling on the stones, bodies piling upon bodies. By the time the massacre ended, hundreds were dead, perhaps thousands, sources conflict, but all agree it was catastrophic. The city exploded. The people of Tenochtitlan, who had endured months of humiliation watching their emperor imprisoned, who had suppressed their rage out of respect for cosmic order, finally broke. They poured into the streets by the thousands, armed with whatever they could find, spears, clubs, stones. They surrounded the Spanish quarters, cutting off all supply routes, raising the bridges on the causeways, transforming the city into the trap Cortés had always feared. Alvarado and his men barricaded themselves inside the palace, surrounded, outnumbered by hundreds to one. They brought Moctezuma out onto the roof, hoping the emperor's presence would calm the crowd. But the people were beyond calming. They had lost respect for Moctezuma, saw him as a collaborator, a man who had betrayed his duty. Stones flew through the air. One struck Moctezuma in the head. The emperor collapsed, was carried back inside, and 3 days later, he died. Whether from his wounds, from despair, or from Spanish hands, accounts differ, and the truth is lost to history. Cortés returned to find Tenochtitlan transformed into a city of siege and fury. He fought his way through hostile forces on the causeways, reaching the Spanish quarters just as Alvarado's garrison was on the verge of collapse. But his arrival did not end the crisis, it only delayed the inevitable. The Spanish were surrounded, trapped in a palace with dwindling food and water, while outside the entire city howled for their blood. Cortés tried negotiation, tried intimidation, tried everything he could think of to break the deadlock. Nothing worked. The Aztecs had chosen a new emperor, Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother, a man who had opposed the Spanish from the beginning and who now had the support of a population united in rage. There would be no more diplomacy. There would be no more captivity disguised as hospitality. There would only be war. On the night of June 30th, 1520, Cortés made the decision to flee. It was flee or die, those were the only options left. The Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies prepared to escape under cover of darkness, loading themselves with as much gold as they could carry. Some took so much they could barely walk, weighted down by greed, unable to imagine abandoning the treasure they had killed for. A rainstorm rolled in, heavy and dark, and under its cover, the evacuation began. They moved quietly at first, crossing the first bridge on the causeway without incident. And then a woman drawing water from the lake saw them. She screamed. Drums began to sound from the temple tops, great booming calls that echoed across the water. The city woke. Thousands of warriors poured onto the causeways, in canoes on either side, attacking from all directions. What followed became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The Spanish fought their way along the causeway in darkness and rain, struggling across gaps where bridges had been raised, harassed constantly by warriors attacking from boats. The weight of the stolen gold became a death sentence. Men stumbled and fell into the water, dragged down by the metal they refused to release, drowning in the lake with treasure clutched in their dying hands. Horses fell, broke their legs in the gaps between bridge sections, screamed as obsidian blades cut them down. Cannons were abandoned. Supplies were lost. Men drowned or were captured and dragged away to be sacrificed. Cortés himself nearly died, fighting desperately to reach the far shore. By the time the survivors staggered off the causeway onto the mainland, they had lost more than 600 Spanish soldiers and thousands of indigenous allies. Most of the horses were dead. Most of the gold was at the bottom of the lake. And Cortés, standing on solid ground watching the survivors stream past, supposedly sat beneath a tree and wept. But he did not surrender. Even in defeat, even having lost more than half his force, Cortés was already planning his return. He retreated to Tlaxcala, where his allies took him in, nursed the wounded, and provided fresh warriors. The Tlaxcalans had their own reasons for continuing the war, they had committed to the Spanish cause, and if Cortés failed, Aztec revenge would be terrible. More than that, they saw opportunity. The Aztec Empire had seemed unbreakable, but La Noche Triste had proven it could be hurt. If the Spanish could be defeated once, the Aztecs could be defeated too. The alliance held. And while Cortés regrouped, an invisible enemy was already moving through Tenochtitlan, more deadly than any army. Smallpox had arrived with the Spanish, carried by an infected African slave in Cortés's expedition. The Mexica had no immunity to European diseases, no resistance built up over generations. The virus spread through Tenochtitlan like fire through dry grass, killing with horrific efficiency. Entire families died within days. Bodies piled in houses, in streets, in canals. The smell of death hung over the city. Cuitlahuac, the warrior emperor who had driven the Spanish out, died of smallpox after ruling for only 80 days. His cousin, Cuauhtémoc, took the throne, young, fierce, absolutely committed to defending the city to the last. But he inherited a city already dying, its population decimated, its morale shattered not just by war but by a plague that seemed to confirm that the gods had abandoned them. Cortés spent the next several months preparing for a siege unlike any the world had seen. He could not storm Tenochtitlan, the causeways were too easily defended, the city too large. But he could strangle it. He built brigantines, small sailing ships designed to operate on the lake, constructed in Tlaxcala and carried piece by piece over the mountains by thousands of indigenous porters. He gathered an army of overwhelming size, perhaps 20,000 warriors from Tlaxcala, Texcoco, and other cities eager to see the Aztecs fall. When he returned to the Valley of Mexico in the spring of 1521, he did not march down the causeways. He launched his ships on the lake, secured the shoreline, and began to cut off every supply route into the city. Tenochtitlan, which had always drawn its strength from the lake, now found the lake turned into a noose. The siege lasted 93 days, and they were days of unimaginable suffering. The Spanish and their allies slowly tightened the circle, cutting off the aqueducts that brought fresh water to the city, preventing food from entering, bombarding defensive positions with cannons. The Aztecs fought back with desperate courage, defending every canal, every street, every building. They dug trenches, set traps, launched nighttime raids against Spanish camps. Cuauhtémoc led from the front, inspiring his warriors by example, refusing to consider surrender. The people of Tenochtitlan ate whatever they could find, grass, tree bark, insects, leather. They drank the brackish water of the lake, which made them sick. The dead were no longer given proper burial, there were too many, and the living were too weak. Bodies floated in the canals. Disease continued to ravage those who had survived the initial smallpox outbreak. And still, they fought. The Spanish strategy was not speed but inevitability. Cortés understood that time was his ally now. Every day without food weakened the defenders. Every day without fresh water made resistance harder. The brigantines patrolled the lake, sinking Aztec canoes, preventing any relief from reaching the city. Indigenous allies from a dozen different cultures fought alongside the Spanish, not because they loved the strangers, but because they hated the Aztecs more. Old grievances, generations of resentment, years of tribute and humiliation, all of it poured out in violence. This was not just a Spanish conquest. This was a civil war, a revolution, the collapse of an empire that had held together through fear and finally discovered that fear has limits. The fighting moved street by street, house by house. The Spanish adopted a brutal tactic, they destroyed everything they captured. Buildings were torn down, canals were filled with rubble, entire neighborhoods were leveled to prevent the Aztecs from retaking them. Tenochtitlan, the jewel of Mesoamerica, was being systematically demolished, transformed from a city into a wasteland. The canals that had once carried flowers and food now carried corpses. The plazas where markets had thrived became battlefields. The temples where the gods had been honored became fortresses and then ruins. And through it all, the people of Tenochtitlan endured, because surrender meant not just defeat but the end of their world, the death of everything they believed gave life meaning. By July 1521, the city was in its death throes. Perhaps 100,000 people had died, from violence, from disease, from starvation. The survivors were skeletal, too weak to fight effectively, too broken to do more than defend the shrinking territory that remained. Cuauhtémoc and the last defenders were pushed back into Tlatelolco, the northern district, the place where the great market had once been. They held out in the ruins, fighting from rooftops, from behind makeshift barricades, with weapons that broke and could not be replaced, with bodies that had nothing left to give. The Spanish could smell victory now, and they pressed harder, eager to finish what had taken so long, eager to claim the gold they believed was still hidden somewhere in the ruins. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape by canoe, trying to slip through the Spanish blockade on the lake. He was captured. The young emperor, barely 25 years old, was brought before Cortés, and the two men faced each other one final time, the conqueror and the last defender of a dying world. The Spanish accounts say Cuauhtémoc pointed to the dagger at Cortés's belt and asked to be killed, saying he had done everything to defend his city and people, and now that he had failed, death was preferable to captivity. Cortés refused. He needed Cuauhtémoc alive, needed him to order the remaining defenders to surrender, to make the victory official and complete. Cuauhtémoc gave the order. The fighting stopped. Tenochtitlan fell. And with it fell an empire, a civilization, a way of understanding the universe that had sustained millions of people for centuries. The Spanish searched desperately for the legendary gold of Tenochtitlan, the treasure they had come so far to claim. But most of it was gone, lost in the lake during La Noche Triste, hidden by Aztecs who knew it was better for the gold to disappear than to enrich their enemies, spent on the war effort, or simply never as vast as Spanish imaginations had made it. What they found was disappointing, far less than they had dreamed. In their frustration, they tortured Cuauhtémoc and other Aztec nobles, burning their feet, demanding they reveal the location of hidden treasure. The young emperor endured the torture in silence, revealing nothing, because perhaps there was nothing to reveal, or perhaps because giving them what they wanted would have been one final defeat he refused to accept. The city itself was destroyed beyond recognition. The Spanish tore down what remained of the temples, using the stones to build their own structures. They filled in the canals, wanting solid ground for streets and buildings in the European style. They built a cathedral on the site of the Great Temple, placing a Christian church directly on top of the spot where Huitzilopochtli had once received his offerings. They renamed everything, erasing Nahuatl names with Spanish ones, as if by changing the words they could change what had happened, could make the conquest clean and righteous instead of what it really was, brutal, opportunistic, and soaked in blood. They called it Mexico City, a name that would outlast the empire, the cathedral, and eventually even the Spanish colonial government itself. The indigenous allies who had fought alongside the Spanish found that victory brought no liberation. The Spanish did not share power, they took it. The Tlaxcalans, who had been promised autonomy and respect, discovered that their new masters were no better than the old ones, and in some ways worse. The Spanish brought new diseases, measles, typhus, influenza, that continued to kill long after the siege ended. Within a century, the indigenous population of Mexico would be reduced by perhaps 90%, one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. The survivors lived under a colonial system that was extractive, cruel, and deeply racist, a system that would last 300 years and whose echoes still resonate today. Cuauhtémoc remained a prisoner for 4 years, dragged along on Cortés's subsequent expeditions as a hostage and symbol. In 1525, during a journey to Honduras, Cortés became convinced, or pretended to become convinced, that Cuauhtémoc was plotting rebellion. On February 28, 1525, the last Aztec emperor was hanged from a ceiba tree in the jungle, far from home, far from the city he had fought so desperately to defend. His body was left hanging as a warning to others, and then cut down and buried in an unmarked grave that has never been found. He was 29 years old. With his death, the last direct connection to the Aztec Empire was severed. The fifth sun had finally set. But the story did not truly end there, because stories never really end, they change shape, become myth, become memory, become the foundation on which new stories are built. The conquest of the Aztec Empire became a defining moment in world history, the collision of two worlds that transformed both forever. The Spanish brought Christianity, European languages, new crops and animals, new forms of government and economy. The indigenous peoples contributed their labor, their knowledge of the land, their agricultural techniques, their own languages and traditions that would blend with Spanish culture to create something new, mestizo culture, a fusion that defines Mexico to this day. The Aztec legacy survived in fragments, in place names, in foods like chocolate and tomatoes that spread around the world, in artistic traditions, in stories passed down through generations, in the DNA of millions who carry Mexica blood in their veins. And so, as we reach the end of this story, we find ourselves standing in ruins that are also foundations, looking at an ending that was also a beginning. The Aztec Empire lasted less than 200 years, a brief flash in the long span of human history. But in that flash, they built something extraordinary, a civilization that could create floating gardens and philosophical poetry, that could conceive of the universe as a fragile thing requiring constant sacrifice, that could build a city on water that made conquistadors weep with wonder even as they destroyed it. They were flawed, as all civilizations are flawed. They were brutal, as all empires are brutal. They believed they were keeping the world alive, and perhaps in their own way, they were. Every story we tell about them, every moment we spend remembering who they were and what they built, keeps some small part of their world from disappearing entirely into the darkness of forgotten time. The fifth sun may have set. But its light, however distant, however dimmed by centuries, still reaches us here in the quiet of this night, whispering of what was lost, and what, against all odds, endures. Sleep now. Let the story settle like dust after a storm. Let the images fade into dreams. And when you wake, remember that all empires fall, all suns set, but the human capacity to create beauty, to seek meaning, to tell stories that outlive stone and steel, that endures. That is the inheritance of the Aztecs, and it belongs to all of us. Rest well.